I woke up to the sound of my hospital room door clicking shut. My sister Heather was standing over my bed, her fingers already peeling back my surgical bandage. "Let's see if you're really hurt," she said, her voice cold and clinical, "or if this is just another one of your attention-seeking stunts." Before I could scream, she dug her fingers into my fresh incision and pulled. I felt my stitches tear one by one like a zipper being ripped open. Warm blood spread across my hospital gown. The fluorescent lights above me blurred into white streaks as my body went into shock. The last thing I saw before everything went black, Heather walking toward the door without looking back, and she was smiling. When I regained consciousness, the nurses told me I'd lost significant blood. They'd had to re-stitch my wound 14 stitches instead of 8. But what they told me next changed everything. The hospital had already filed a report, and there was camera footage. Have you ever been hurt by someone who was supposed to protect you and watch the world finally see the truth? My name is Paige Warren. I'm 36 years old, and I run a freelance accounting business from my small apartment in suburban Portland. By most measures, I've built a decent life, stable income, independence, a quiet routine that suits me. But in my family's eyes, I've always been the one who didn't quite make it. To understand what happened in that hospital room, you need to understand what it's like to grow up invisible in your own family. I was 5 years old when my sister Heather was born. From that moment on, everything changed. The attention, the praise, the concern, all of it shifted to her like a spotlight finding its true target. I don't remember when I stopped expecting my parents to notice me. I just remember learning slowly and painfully that my role was to stay out of the way and not cause problems. Every conflict between Heather and me ended the same way. "Be the bigger person, Paige. She's younger than you. Why do you always have to make things difficult?" I heard those words so many times they became background noise in my life. But it wasn't just favoritism. Looking back now, I can see a pattern I refused to recognize for decades. The morning of my biggest job interview, Heather accidentally spilled coffee across my laptop, destroying the presentation I'd spent weeks preparing. Before her college graduation party, my allergy medication mysteriously vanished from my purse, leaving me so sick I couldn't attend. Small incidents, plausible accidents, always benefiting Heather. I trained myself to dismiss them because the alternative, believing my own sister was sabotaging me, was too painful to accept. When the doctors found the cyst on my ovary, I didn't expect sympathy from my family, but I didn't expect complete indifference either. The cyst had grown large, 8 centimeters, and wrapped around my ovary in a way that made minimally invasive surgery too dangerous. My surgeon explained that I'd need open abdominal surgery, a 5-inch incision, 3 weeks of recovery minimum. When I called my mother to tell her, her first words weren't about my health. "You'll be healed by my retirement party, right? The whole extended family is coming. It's in 2 weeks. Heather's response came by text. "Don't turn this into a bigger deal than it is. Mom's party is what matters." I went into surgery alone. No one offered to drive me. No one sat in the waiting room. I woke up in recovery with a nurse holding my hand, a stranger showing me more kindness than my own family had in years. On the second day after surgery, Heather surprised me by showing up at the hospital. She brought flowers, yellow daisies, and a glass vase. I couldn't remember the last time she'd given me anything. "How are you feeling?" she asked, setting the flowers on my bedside table. "The doctors say you'll be out before Mom's party." She asked detailed questions about my recovery timeline, my pain levels, when the stitches would come out. Margaret Torres, the senior nurse on duty, noticed Heather's interest, but smiled warmly. Sisters worry about each other. Before Heather left, she squeezed my hand. "Get better soon. We need you there." It was the nicest thing she'd said to me in years. I wanted so badly to believe it was genuine, but something in my chest felt tight, a warning I couldn't name. That night I woke to the sound of my door opening. The hallway light cast a thin strip of yellow across the floor. Heather was standing at my bedside, her hand hovering inches above my bandage. "Just checking on you," she whispered. But in the dim light, I could see her face clearly. She wasn't checking on me. She was studying me the way someone studies a problem they're trying to solve. I told myself I was imagining things. Heather was just worried about me. Sisters check on each other in hospitals. There was nothing sinister about her standing over my bed in the middle of the night. I repeated these thoughts until I almost believed them, Almost. The next morning, I woke to gray light filtering through the window and the steady beep of my heart monitor. My body ached from the surgery, but the pain medication kept the worst of it at bay. I was alone in the room. The morning shift nurses were busy with their rounds, and I could hear the distant clatter of breakfast trays being delivered down the hall. When my door opened, I expected a nurse. Instead, Heather walked in. She looked different than she had the day before. No flowers this time, no warm smile. Her face was set in hard lines, and her eyes moved over me with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, calculating, like she was looking at something that disgusted her. She closed the door behind her and stood at the foot of my bed. "You know what I think?" Her voice was flat. "I think you're milking this whole thing, playing the victim so everyone feels sorry for you." I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my abdomen. "What are you talking about? Mom's retirement party is in less than 2 weeks. The whole family is coming, and suddenly you need major surgery." She moved closer, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. "You want everyone's attention on you instead of her. You've always been jealous of the attention she gives me. This is just another one of your stunts." "Heather, I have an 8-centimeter cyst. I didn't choose this." She was standing right beside me now, looking down at my bandaged abdomen. "Let's see if you're really hurt," she said, her voice dropping to something almost like a whisper. "Or if this is just another one of your attention-seeking performances." Before I could process what was happening, her fingers were on my bandage. She peeled it back with one sharp motion, exposing the fresh incision beneath. I saw my own skin swollen and red, held together by a row of dark stitches. "Heather, stop!" She didn't stop. She dug her fingers into the wound and pulled. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I felt my stitches tearing one by one like thread being ripped from fabric. I screamed. I screamed so loud my throat burned, but she didn't flinch. She just kept pulling until something inside me gave way completely. Blood, warm and wet, spreading across my hospital gown, soaking into the sheets beneath me. My vision blurred. The fluorescent lights above me stretched into long, white streaks. Through the haze of shock, I saw Heather step back from the bed. She looked at her hands, now stained red, and wiped them calmly on a tissue from my bedside table. Then she walked toward the door. She didn't run. She didn't call for help. She just walked steady and unhurried, like someone leaving a business meeting. The last thing I saw before everything went black was her back disappearing through the doorway. She never looked back. I don't know how long I was unconscious. Minutes, maybe longer. The next thing I remember is voices shouting and hands pressing against my stomach. A nurse named Diana had found me during her morning rounds. She told me later that I was lying in a pool of my own blood, my face white as paper, my pulse barely there. They rushed me back into surgery. The damage was worse than the original incision. My surgeon had to cut away the torn tissue to get clean edges for the new stitches. 14 this time instead of 8. The operation took longer than expected because of the blood loss. When I woke up in recovery, a doctor I didn't recognize was standing beside my bed. He explained that my wound had been forcibly disrupted by external manipulation. Those were his exact words. He said the pattern of the tear was inconsistent with anything I could have done to myself. The direction of the force indicated someone standing at my bedside pulling outward. He asked me if I knew who had been in my room that morning. I told him it was my sister. He wrote something in my chart and said the hospital would be filing a report. I barely heard him. All I could think about was calling my mother, telling her what Heather had done, finally having proof that I wasn't crazy, that all those accidents over the years weren't accidents at all. When I finally got my phone and dialed Mom's number, she answered on the second ring. But before I could say a word, she spoke first. "Paige, Heather already told me what happened." My heart stopped. "What did she tell you? She said you got upset about the party, about not being the center of attention." Mom's voice was colder than I had ever heard it. "She said you did this to yourself. For attention, just like you always do." I couldn't breathe. "Mom, that's not what happened. She came into my room. She ripped out my stitches. I have 14 new ones because of what she did." "Heather said you would say that. She said you would try to blame her." In the background, I heard my father's voice. "We can't deal with this drama right now. We have the party to plan." The line went dead. I sat there holding my phone, staring at the screen. For 36 years, I had absorbed every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked and undervalued. I had told myself that family was family, that blood meant something, that if I was just patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, they would eventually see me. But sitting in that hospital bed, my body broken and my family's betrayal echoing in my ears, something shifted inside me. The old hurt was there, familiar as a scar, but rising up alongside it was something new, something I had never allowed myself to feel before: anger. Not the quiet, swallowed kind I had lived with my whole life. This was different. This was the anger of 36 years of silence finally finding its voice. That afternoon, Margaret Torres came to check on me. She was the senior nurse who had been on duty when Heather visited the one who had noticed all those detailed questions about my recovery. She looked at my new bandages, at the IV dripping fluids back into my depleted body, at my face still streaked with dried tears. "Tell me what happened," she said quietly. So I told her. All of it. Heather's visit, her accusations, the moment she dug her fingers into my wound and pulled. Margaret didn't interrupt. She didn't look at me with doubt or pity. When I finished, she sat down in the chair beside my bed and said something I will never forget. "I was in the hallway when it happened. I heard you scream, and I saw who walked out." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "I've been a nurse for 35 years, Paige. I know what guilt looks like when it's walking away from something terrible. Your sister didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied." For the first time in my entire life, someone believed me without hesitation. The next morning, a woman in a gray suit entered my room. She introduced herself as the patient safety officer and placed a folder on my table. "Ms. Warren, we've reviewed the hallway footage. Your sister entered at 7:43 a.m. and exited at 7:47, 4 minutes. She looked up at me. When she left, she checked her phone, fixed her hair, and walked away at a normal pace. She didn't call for help. She didn't look back." The woman paused. "That's not how innocent people behave." The patient safety officer opened the folder and spread several printed images across my hospital table. They were screenshots from the hallway camera, time-stamped down to the second. I saw Heather entering my room at 7:43 a.m., then leaving at 7:47 a.m. 4 minutes. Just 4 minutes to change everything. "Watch her body language," the officer said, pointing to the sequence of images. In the first frame, Heather was walking toward my door with purpose. In the last frame, she was leaving. But there was no panic in her posture, no urgency. She was checking her phone. In another image, she had paused by a window to adjust her hair, studying her reflection like someone on their way to brunch. "I've investigated dozens of incidents in this hospital," the officer continued. "When someone witnesses an accident, when they see a loved one in distress, they react. They freeze. They run for help. They scream for a nurse. Your sister did none of those things." She gathered the images back into the folder. "This is the behavior of someone who completed exactly what they came to do." I stared at those images until they blurred. Some part of me had still been hoping for another explanation. An accident. A misunderstanding. Something that would let me believe my sister wasn't capable of this. But the camera didn't lie. Heather had walked out of my room while I lay bleeding, and she hadn't even broken her stride. The officer told me she would return the next day to discuss my options. After she left, I lay in my bed feeling hollowed out, like someone had scooped everything inside me and left only the shell. That was when my phone buzzed with an unknown number. The voice on the other end was hesitant. "Is this Paige Warren Heather's sister?" I said yes. "My name is Jenna Kowalski. I used to be friends with Heather. I heard about what happened to you, and I need to tell you something." Jenna explained that she and Heather had been close in college, best friends she thought, until Heather slept with Jenna's boyfriend, and then when Jenna confronted her, convinced their entire friend group that Jenna was unstable and making things up. It took Jenna years to rebuild her reputation and her self-trust. A year ago, Heather had reached out to reconnect, full of apologies and promises that she had changed. Jenna wanted to believe her. 2 days before your surgery," Jenna said, her voice tight. Heather texted me asking about stitches. She wanted to know if stitches came undone, would it cause an infection? How much longer would someone have to stay in the hospital? Jenna paused. "I thought she was worried about you. I told her it could add weeks to recovery depending on the damage. I had no idea she was planning something." My hands were shaking. Do you still have those messages? I have screenshots of everything, including one where she said, if Paige is still in the hospital during Mom's party, at least we won't have to deal with her drama. Jenna's voice cracked. I'm so sorry, Paige. I should have seen it. I should have known she hadn't changed. I thanked her and asked her to send everything to the patient safety officer. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Heather had planned this. 2 days before she ripped my stitches out, she was already researching how much damage it would cause. She wanted me stuck in this hospital bed. She wanted me to miss the party. She wanted me out of the way so she could remain the center of attention, just like she had been my entire life. The next morning, my phone rang again. This time I recognized the number. Aunt Helen, my mother's older sister. We hadn't spoken in over a year. Paige, honey, I heard what happened. Her voice was warm, but serious. I need to tell you something. Something your mother has chosen to forget, but I never did. She told me about something that happened 18 years ago when I was 18 and Heather was 13. I had received a full scholarship to UC Berkeley. It was my dream, my ticket to a different life. But that same summer, my mother was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. My father picked up double shifts at work to cover the medical bills, which meant he was never home. Someone needed to manage Mom's care drive, her to appointments, handle the insurance paperwork, and look after Heather, who was demanding constant attention and emotional reassurance even at 13. That someone was me. You gave up your scholarship, Aunt Helen said. You stayed home for 2 years while your mother recovered. You put your entire life on hold for that family. I remembered. Of course I remembered. But I had buried it so deep that I almost convinced myself it didn't matter anymore. When your mother got better, did anyone thank you? Did anyone acknowledge what you sacrificed? Helen's voice hardened. No. They acted like it never happened. And 4 years later, when Heather graduated high school, your parents paid for her entire college education without a second thought. I couldn't speak. The words were stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat. You gave up everything for them, Paige, and this is how they repay you. I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I should have. But I'm saying it now. You don't owe them anything. Not anymore. After Aunt Helen hung up, I lay in my hospital bed and let the tears come. Not tears of sadness this time. These were tears of recognition, of finally seeing the full picture of what my life had been. I had spent 36 years being the responsible one, the forgiving one, the one who always put family first. And what had it gotten me? A sister who tried to sabotage me at every turn, parents who believed her lies without question, a lifetime of being invisible in my own family. That afternoon, the patient safety officer returned. She sat down beside my bed and explained my options clearly. The hospital had enough evidence to transfer my case to the police, the camera footage, the medical documentation, Jenna's testimony and screenshots. If I wanted to press charges, I could. This is your choice, she said. No one can make it for you. But I want you to know that what happened to you was a crime, and you have every right to pursue justice. I thought about 36 years of being told to be the bigger person, of swallowing my hurt so others could be comfortable, of forgiving people who never once asked for my forgiveness because they never believed they did anything wrong. I thought about the scholarship I gave up, the career I rebuilt from nothing, the family that never once asked what any of it cost me. Then I looked at the officer and said words I had never allowed myself to say before. Do it. File the report. I'm done being invisible. She nodded and made a note in her folder. I'll have the detective contact you tomorrow. That evening, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was different than it had been before. Not angry this time. Shaken. Almost pleading. Paige, please, don't do this. Think about what it will do to our family, to your sister's career, to my retirement party. Can't we just handle this privately? Can't you just let it go like you always do? I let her words hang in the air for a moment. 36 years of conditioning told me to say yes, to smooth things over, to be the bigger person one more time. But I was done being the bigger person. No, I said, and I hung up. The silence after I hung up on my mother lasted about 3 seconds. Then my phone started buzzing again. I turned it off and set it face down on my hospital table. For the first time in my life, I had said no to my family, and I wasn't going to take it back. I was discharged from the hospital 5 days later. The doctors wanted to keep me longer, but I needed to be in my own space, surrounded by my own things. I needed to think clearly, and I couldn't do that in a hospital bed with nurses checking on me every few hours. The detective assigned to my case gave me her card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. I told her I would do more than remember. I would find everything. The first thing I did when I got home was search through my phone. I scrolled back through months of text messages from Heather, looking for the one she sent before visiting me in the hospital. I found it quickly. "Don't worry, I'll come check on you. Make sure you're not exaggerating like usual." I stared at those words. Make sure you're not exaggerating. She had already decided I was faking before she ever walked into my room. I screenshotted the message and sent it to the detective. Then I kept scrolling. Further back, months, years. I was looking for something I had never allowed myself to see before. I found the text Heather sent the morning my laptop was ruined. "Good luck with your interview today. Hope everything goes smoothly." She had sent it at 6 in the morning, hours before she accidentally spilled coffee across my keyboard. I found another message from the week before her graduation party. "Can't wait for you to be there. It means so much to me." That was 2 days before my allergy medication vanished from my purse. A pattern. Always a sweet message before something went wrong. Always plausible deniability. I had never connected these dots because I didn't want to believe my own sister was capable of sabotaging me. But the evidence was right there in my hands, stretching back years. I sent everything to the detective. Then I called Jenna Kowalski. She answered on the first ring like she had been waiting. I asked her if she had anything else, any other messages or conversations that might help. She said she had been going through her old texts ever since we spoke, and she had found more. Screenshots of Heather complaining about me over the years. Messages where Heather called me dramatic, attention-seeking, pathetic. A conversation from 2 years ago where Heather joked about wishing I would just disappear so family events could be peaceful. Jenna sent me everything, and I forwarded it all to the detective. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to fight my battles. I was building my own case piece by piece. 3 days after I got home, my mother showed up at my apartment. I heard her knocking and almost didn't answer, but some part of me needed to face her. I opened the door and found her standing there with red-rimmed eyes and a tissue crumpled in her hand. "You're destroying our family," she said, pushing past me into my living room. "My retirement party is in 4 days. Everyone is going to be talking about this instead of celebrating me. Are you happy now?" I stood by the door, my arms crossed over my still tender abdomen. "Your party isn't ruined because of me, Mom. It's ruined because Heather attacked me to make sure I couldn't attend." "That's not what happened. Heather said you—" "Did you ever ask yourself why she did it that particular week?" I interrupted. 2 weeks before your party. Just enough time to keep me hospitalized through the whole thing. She researched it, Mom. She texted her friend asking how long someone would stay in the hospital if their stitches came undone. She planned this. My mother's mouth opened, then closed. I watched the confusion flicker across her face. She hadn't considered the timing. She hadn't considered anything beyond Heather's version of events. "I don't believe that," she finally said, but her voice wavered. "You don't have to believe it. The police do, and they have evidence." She left without saying goodbye. I closed the door behind her and leaned against it, my heart pounding. That conversation had cost me something, but it had also given me something back, my voice. 2 days later, my father called. It was the first time he had reached out to me directly in years. His voice sounded tired, older than I remembered. "Paige, I know things haven't been fair. I know your mother and I have made mistakes." He paused. "But this is family. Can't we handle this privately? Do we really need police and lawyers involved?" I took a breath before answering. "You had 36 years to handle things privately, Dad. Every time Heather did something to hurt me, you chose silence. Every time Mom took her side, you said nothing. This is what happens when silence stops working." He didn't argue. He just sighed and said he hoped I knew what I was doing. Then he hung up. I knew exactly what I was doing, for the first time in my life. What I didn't know was that Heather was about to make everything worse for herself. The detective called me a week later with news I hadn't expected. Margaret Torres, the nurse who had witnessed Heather leaving my room, had come forward with new evidence. Heather had found Margaret's home address through one of those people finder websites. She had shown up at Margaret's door with a gift basket and an envelope of cash. Margaret families have conflicts, Heather had said, according to the recording. If you could just remember things a little less dramatically, we'd all be so grateful. But Margaret had received a strange voicemail from Heather the day before. Too sweet, too eager to connect. After 35 years as a nurse, Margaret knew when something felt wrong. Before she opened her door, she started recording on her phone. She captured everything. Heather's offer, the cash, the request to change her testimony. Heather now faced an additional charge, witness tampering, a felony. The detective told me this would significantly strengthen the case. Heather's lawyer would almost certainly push for a plea deal now. The evidence was overwhelming. My mother's retirement party happened without me. I was still recovering, still unable to stand for long periods or sit comfortably. But I heard about it afterward. Aunt Helen attended and made no effort to hide her coldness toward Heather. Extended family members who had heard whispers about what happened kept asking where I was, what had happened to me. Cousins exchanged glances. Heather tried to act normal, smiling and making small talk, but no one looked at her the same way. My mother called me the day after the party. Her voice was hollow. "It wasn't much of a celebration," she admitted. "Your father barely spoke the whole time. And Heather," she trailed off. "People kept asking about you, asking what happened. I didn't know what to say." For the first time, Heather's control over the family narrative had cracked. At the very event she had tried so hard to dominate, she had become the subject of whispers instead of admiration. 5 days before the court date, my phone rang. I looked at the screen and felt my stomach tighten. "Heather." I answered. Her voice was smaller than I had ever heard it. No confidence, no superiority, just something that sounded almost like fear. "Paige, I need to see you, just once. Before everything ends. Please." Every instinct told me to say no, to hang up like I had with my mother, to let the court handle everything. But I realized I needed this too. Not for closure, not for forgiveness. I needed to hear what my sister would say when there was nothing left to hide behind. "Fine," I said. "One meeting, but on my terms." We met at a small cafe 3 blocks from the courthouse. I chose the location because it was public, well lit, and far enough from our family's usual places that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I arrived early and sat with my back to the wall watching the door. When Heather walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked smaller somehow. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail instead of her usual polished style. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes. She spotted me and walked over slowly like someone approaching a ledge they weren't sure they wanted to step off. She sat down across from me and immediately started crying. The tears looked rehearsed, the way she dabbed at her eyes with a tissue she had ready in her hand. "Paige, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I've been under so much stress and I just snapped. It was a moment of madness." She reached across the table toward my hand, but I pulled back. "If you drop this, we can go back to how things were. We can be sisters again. I know I can make it up to you." I watched her performance without reacting. I had seen this version of Heather before, the one who cried on command and said all the right words, but I wasn't the same person who used to fall for it. "Why did you really do it?" I asked quietly. Not the excuse, the real reason. Her tears stopped almost instantly. Something shifted behind her eyes, a flash of the real Heather beneath the mask. "Because you were going to ruin everything." Her voice hardened. "Mom's party, the family. You always have to make things about you. Poor Paige with her surgery. Poor Paige who needs everyone's attention." "I was having a medical emergency, Heather. I didn't choose to have a cyst." "You could have waited. You could have scheduled it for after the party. But no, you had to do it right then, right when everyone was supposed to be focused on Mom." She leaned forward and I saw something darker flicker beneath her surface. "And I couldn't let them start noticing you, asking questions, feeling sorry for you instead of—" She stopped herself, but I heard what she didn't finish, instead of me. In that moment, everything clicked into place. Heather would never fully admit what she did or why. She would never look me in the eye and say the truth out loud. But I finally understood. My sister didn't hate me. She feared me. She feared what would happen if anyone started seeing me clearly, because then they might see what she had taken. The attention, the support, the love that should have been shared between us. Heather had built her entire identity on being the special one, the important one, the one who mattered. And she had spent her whole life making sure I stayed invisible so that identity could survive. I stood up from the table. I used to think if I was patient enough, kind enough, invisible enough, you'd eventually see me as a sister instead of a threat. I picked up my purse. But you were never going to change, Heather, because you need me to be nothing, so you can feel like something. I looked at her one last time. That's not my burden to carry anymore. I walked out of that cafe and didn't look back. The court date came 3 weeks later. Heather's lawyer had pushed hard for a quick resolution. With the evidence stacked against her, a trial would only make things worse. The video footage, the text messages, Jenna's testimony, Margaret's recording of the attempted bribery. There was no version of events where Heather came out looking innocent. The prosecution offered a plea deal. She took it. Misdemeanor assault, 2 years probation. The witness tampering charge was reduced to attempted coercion with concurrent probation. Fines totaling $10,000. Medical restitution of $14,000 to cover my extended hospital stay and second surgery. 12 months of mandatory psychological counseling, 200 hours of community service, and a criminal record that would appear on every background check for the rest of her life. She didn't go to prison. Part of me had wanted her to in the beginning. But watching her walk out of that courtroom, I realized that what she received was its own kind of sentence. Every job application from now on would require her to check a box. Every new relationship would eventually involve an explanation. Every future opportunity would carry the weight of what she had done. Her carefully constructed image, the successful sister, the golden child, the one everyone admired, had shattered in a way that couldn't be fixed with apologies or tears. Reputation doesn't heal with stitches. A week after the court date, 2 letters arrived at my apartment. The first was from my mother. Her handwriting was shaky, like she had written it slowly, thinking about each word. I spoke with Helen, she wrote. She reminded me of things I had chosen to forget. Your scholarship, the years you gave up, everything you did while I was sick and I was too focused on myself to notice. I don't know when I stopped seeing you. Maybe I never really did. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just need you to know I see you now, finally, and I'm sorry it took this long. The second letter was from my father. It was shorter, his handwriting cramped and hesitant. I should have spoken up. Every time your mother favored Heather, every time you were treated unfairly, I told myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. I can't fix 36 years of silence, but I can start speaking now, if you'll let me. I read both letters twice. Then I set them on my kitchen table and sat there for a long time, feeling something shift inside me. I didn't call either of my parents that day. I wasn't ready. But something that had been knotted in my chest for decades began to loosen just slightly. Over the following weeks, I made decisions about my family. I didn't cut them off completely, but I set clear terms. To my mother, I said, "We can rebuild, slowly. But I won't pretend the past didn't happen to make you comfortable, and I won't shrink myself anymore so Heather can feel big." To my father, I said, "Words are a start, but I'll be watching for actions." To Heather, I said nothing. Some doors need to stay closed, not out of hatred, but out of self-preservation. If she ever does the real work of change years from now, maybe there will be a conversation. But I'm not waiting for it. I'm done waiting. I started seeing a therapist, not because I was broken, but because I deserved to heal. In our sessions, I began to understand something that changed how I saw my entire life. I was never invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because I kept dimming my own light to make others comfortable. On my balcony, I replanted a flower that Heather had mocked years ago. "You can't even keep a plant alive," she had said, laughing. This time I tended it carefully, watering it, adjusting the light, giving it what it needed to grow. And this time it bloomed. Yellow petals bright against the Portland gray. For 36 years, I believed that being good meant sacrificing without limits, forgiving without conditions, disappearing so others could shine. I thought if I just loved hard enough, gave enough, stayed quiet enough, my family would eventually see me. But lying in that hospital bed, bleeding from a wound my own sister gave me, I finally understood the truth. I wasn't invisible because I lacked worth. I was invisible because I kept making myself small so others could feel big. Heather didn't attack me because she hated me. She attacked me because she was afraid. Afraid that if anyone started seeing me, they would see what she had taken, and she had spent her whole life making sure that never happened. But here's what Heather never understood. You can't keep someone invisible forever. Eventually, the light finds a way through. I used to think forgiveness meant letting go of what happened. Now I know better. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about refusing to let their actions define your future. I don't forgive Heather for her sake. I release her grip on my life for mine. And that's the day I stopped asking permission to exist. The day I stopped waiting to be seen by people who had chosen not to look. The day I finally understood that my worth was never determined by their attention. It was always mine to claim. Some people will never see you no matter how brightly you shine. But that's not a reason to dim your light. That's a reason to shine anyway. For yourself. For the people who do see you. And for the person you're still becoming. I am Paige Warren. I am 36 years old. I am no longer invisible, and I am just getting started. Thank you for staying with me through Paige's story. Before you go, I want to share something important that this story teaches us. Family should be a source of love and support, not a place where you have to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. If someone in your life consistently makes you feel invisible, unworthy, or like your pain doesn't matter, that is not love. That is control. And you have every right to protect yourself from it, even if that person shares your blood. Setting boundaries is not selfish. Speaking up for yourself is not dramatic. And choosing your own well-being over someone else's comfort is not betrayal. It is survival. It is self-respect. It is what you deserve. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of your own experiences, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. We share stories like this every week. Stories about strength, justice, and the courage to reclaim your voice. I would love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had to stand up against someone who was supposed to love you? What did you learn from that experience? Your story might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today.